Thank you for joining us today for the Winter World Language webinar series focused on the analysis of our World Language Essential Standards or our state standards. Today's broadcast is all about the structure of our state standards, and we're going to be looking at that from some different perspectives. Today's agenda includes a number of things, and remember, we have a whole hour and a half together to really have a good conversation about our state standards and their structure and how that looks going forward. First, we'll start with our welcome, and then we'll have an overview of both state and national standards. After that, we'll look at our North Carolina or NC revision process for standards and the timeline for that in regards to world language standards through 2025. After that, we'll look at the impact of the state standard structure on our work as educators. And then we'll discuss lessons learned from the state standards toolkit components that most of you are very familiar with. We'll finish out with some reminders and announcement for all world language educators, and then have our wrap up and cover any other questions that we haven't gotten to. That's our agenda for today. Before we get going, as part of our welcome, I want to go over the WebEx event control panel. We're in what's called a WebEx event, so we can have quite a few people on the line with us today. You should see something on your screen very similar to what's pictured there under WebEx event control panel. So a snapshot of the slides that we're showing, and then your control panel probably to the right, and it should have the speaker's initials up there and a chat box and things like that. That's where you'll access everything is to the right. Now, this may look a little different depending on whether you have accessed WebEx online on like a laptop or via the app on a smart device. It also may look a little different depending on which browser you chose to access it today. As you probably know, in a webinar, all participants are on mute because we are recording, so it cuts down on our background noise. And then the control panel on the side, as I said, displays the host or speaker. And today that's me, so I am working on my own. It'll also display our polling questions periodically and our chat box. I should have put chat instead of Q&A. Our chat box is always available, and it looks like several of you found it. I'm seeing some messages of greetings, but do find that now and make sure when you send a message that you're sending it either to everyone, if that's a possibility, or to all attendees or all panelists. So you should have some functionality in the chat box that should let you send your message to who you want. You'll also need to make sure your chat box is ready to go because we'll be using it in some of our activities today. Finally, on your control panel, you probably noticed these buttons at the bottom, and those are your quick access buttons if you need them. Obviously, the chat one is there. And you can see a list of participants and that kind of thing if you want to. If you've joined us by phone today, you will still need to participate actively, but that's what the little phone symbol is for. And then, of course, we've always learned that 3 dots means that there's more controls there. So you can click on that when you need more controls. At the end, when we exit, you'll hit that red button with the X on it, and that'll take you out of the webinar. If you accidentally hit it in the meantime and need to come back into the webinar, you can still use the same link as you used to get in originally. So let's get started with our first poll question, which is, why did you join the broadcast today? I always want to know what your motivation is and why everyone is here and what you want to learn about. So you can check all that apply. Was it to access professional development made for world languages? Was it to earn 1.5 contact hours for license renewal? Was it to gather information to share with a department, a team, or someone else? Was it because you want to learn about the standards and the standards revision process that we're going to be going through? Or did you need to ask a question about world languages, our state standards, policy, or something like that? I'll go ahead and run this poll. And like I said, it should show up in your control panel, and you can check as many of these as answer the question for you. All right, go ahead. We have 1 minute, but I know this probably won't take you long to answer. All right, we just have a few moments left. If you haven't got your answer in, now would be the time. Remember that you need to actively participate in order to earn your contact hour certificate. All right. Thank you for sharing that. I'm going to go ahead and close our poll and share the results with you because you're probably eager to see what everybody said. So let's take a look. It looks like many of you here are either because you want to access professional development for world languages or because you want to earn your 1.5 contact hour certificate. Both excellent reasons to do that. One thing to know is that these World Language webinar series are designed specifically for us as world language educators. And another important thing about them, as we all know, is that you can earn your certificate. Once the attendance report comes back, we process that, and anyone who has been here for the time they need to be and been actively participating will receive a contact hour certificate as an attachment in an email that you can turn into your central office or your school or whoever needs to approve those kinds of professional development hours for you. Also, a fair number of you are here because you want to learn about the standards and the standards revision process. I'm glad to hear about that. We're going to be starting that soon. In fact, we already technically have. And so we need to talk about that and start gathering input and feedback on it. And finally, a number of you are also here because you want to gather information to share. And that's always important to remember too with these broadcasts. I post all of our archives, a recording of this broadcast, the slides in 3 different formats, Google Slides, PowerPoint, and PDF so that you can adapt them, and any links or handouts that we use. So you can always get that information and then share it with others in the format that's best and not have to recreate slides or anything like that. So it's all there for you to use. All right. Thank you so much for participating in that poll and letting me know why you're here today. I see a couple of you saying you got here after the poll had closed. Please don't worry. We have other polls that you can participate in as we go forward. All right, well, let's get underway today and talk about our state and national standards and really just get a good overview. Most of you, I think, are very familiar with the 2 graphics we have there on the screen. The first one that says World Languages, the North Carolina Standard Course of Study. That's sort of our icon for our state standards that we've had now for several years. And then the 3 rings, the 5 C's as we call them, are ACTFL standards. The American Council on the Teaching of Foreign Languages, or ACTFL, our national professional organization. Our state standards, like almost every state standards, are of course aligned to the ACTFL standards, but we do have our own unique state standards that we're going to be talking about. So I thought I'd start today with an overview of our state and national standards and how they kind of compare to each other so that you can see them hopefully in a different way maybe than you've looked at them before. So to get started, I have another poll question for you. I want you to think about where we are as a state with standards in comparison to other states, and in fact with ACTFL, who has the national standards that we align to. So how does North Carolina's history and timeline with standards compare to those other states in the ACTFL national standards? Is North Carolina usually a little ahead and serving as a model to others? Are we just on track and in sync with others that are updating standards? Does North Carolina follow 1 to 2 years after updates in other states and at the national level to align to the national standards? Or maybe you're not sure without doing some research. I'm going to go ahead and open this question. And you can respond with the best answer that you think is how we work with our state standards and others. All right, please be sure and get your response in. And you should be able now to see the responses. I can tell we're a room full of educators because the most chosen answer was the last one. I'm not sure about this question without doing some research. Could certainly appreciate that, want to find out a little bit more. And that is what we'll be talking about today. You were almost evenly split between the first two answers, either that North Carolina is usually a little ahead and serving as a model to others, or that we're right on track and in sync with how others are doing it when things are happening in other states and at the national level. And even a few of you said North Carolina follows 1 to 2 years behind after the updates are made so that we can align to our national standards. Well, overall, the actual answer is the first one. North Carolina is usually a little ahead and serves as a model to others. But don't just take my word for it. I want to show you the research and some things behind it so that you're familiar with how we do things in North Carolina and how that is comparing to things like our actual national standards that we're aligning to. So let's begin with an overview of our state and national standards. And you can see there's a timeline on there. Now, I should say before we begin that, in fact, the history of state standards in North Carolina for world languages and every other subject too actually begins in the 1980s. When we first had what was not exactly called a standard course of study then, but would become our standard course of study. And we had things like the Balanced Education Plan, the BEP, which some of you may recall. However, I'm starting where I am because of where our current State Board of Education policies show, so that if you had to look up this history and look up this timeline, you could find clear references to it. So in 1994, North Carolina has its first set of state standards that are documented in our State Board of Education policy SCOS, standing for Standard Course of Study 009, which basically says we will have state standards in world languages. So that was in 1994. A year later, ACTFL published the first edition of the national standards that we had ever seen. Prior to that, ACTFL and other content areas as well did not have national standards for state standards to align to. State standards were a relatively new concept, and so many professional organizations at the state, regional, and national level were working on that, either working within a state or a region or across states, regions, and even the country. So ACTFL published their first edition of national standards 1 year after North Carolina got theirs. As we continued on in 1999, not too long later, North Carolina approved our second set of standards. We'd made some updates and changes from that first set in 1994, and so we approved our second set. That same year, ACTFL released the second edition of Standards for Foreign Language Learning in the 21st Century. You may be familiar with that book. Some of you may even have copies of that or other editions of it, maybe not just necessarily the second edition or the first edition. So at that point, like I said, we're a little ahead. And I will tell you that other states are definitely modeling us and looking at our standards to inform their own work to develop state standards that will work for them. And moving forward, in 2004, North Carolina has its third set of state standards. So again, we went through a revision process, updated some things, and our State Board of Education approved them in 2004. 2 years later, after that, ACTFL published the third edition of the national standards. And so once again, North Carolina is working a little bit ahead, kind of on the cutting edge, but also involved with ACTFL's work. Because another thing that's happened over time, since North Carolina has clearly established itself as a leader in things like state standards and other things with world language programs and strategies, there was often one or more educators from North Carolina involved in things like the national standards. We've also been called on a number of times to help our neighboring states or our colleagues in other states, and you probably experienced that yourselves as educators or as teachers. So we are kind of well known as a state for working a little bit ahead. Which brings me to our most recent work. In 2010, North Carolina approved its fourth set of state standards for world languages, and this time they were the World Language Essential Standards. And I say this time because there were some new things that happened. Number one, it was the first time we had been called world languages. Prior to that, we were called foreign languages or second languages. And we just felt like the term world language would be a better way to think about what we teach. We also had, for the first time, proficiency-based standards, which means we were looking at the proficiency level students needed to achieve by the time they left a course or a program that they were in. Now, ACTFL had a proficiency scale that we were working with for some time, but no state prior to us had ever put together a set of K-12 standards that were actually proficiency-based. And that really helped us out given the multiple entry points we have. So, for example, a student can start studying a language in kindergarten or in 7th grade or in high school, and they're still beginning language learner. So we wanted to look at their language acquisition and development over time, starting at that novice low level and moving forward as they built up. 5 years after that, in 2015, ACTFL released its fourth edition. They had retitled the national standards and gotten away from foreign languages in it to World Readiness Standards for Learning Languages. And so you see a picture of that document. And again, there were a number of people from North Carolina who helped write that document and also were called on to give feedback and input as it was being drafted and readied for release. So that's pretty significant. And that's kind of our brief timeline and overview of where we've been with state and national standards. Here is a screenshot of our current state standards. I think most of you are probably familiar with the weave graphic you see pictured on the right side of the screen. That weave graphic is also visible in our administrator guides, which we're going to talk about later today. But it's a really good way to show how our standards and the strands work together to make a world language classroom and a world language learning environment. So this is our WLES, World Language Essential Standards. We love our acronym, so that's WLES. The 5 C's from ACTFL are woven together into the strands and standards. And so we break them down in a way that works for us. So our 4 standards of the World Language Essential Standards are, number 1, interpersonal communication. And that's that informal communication we do when we talk to each other, when we text each other, that kind of thing. Standard number 2 is interpretive communication, and that's reading, listening, and viewing. Standard number 3 is presentational communication, and this is when we're sharing something with an audience. So we're giving a presentation, either orally or signing, or we're doing writing, and that we're doing a presentation that way. And then finally, we have culture. That's standard number 4. And so you see that those are the main standards we look at, and every language program looks at these standards and these strands. There are a couple of tweaks with that. So for example, interpersonal communication is something that does happen informally on a day-to-day basis. And when we think about, for example, classical languages like Latin and ancient Greek, where those languages are no longer spoken in someone's first language, they're not used in quite the same way. So classical languages just focus on standards 2, 3, and 4 for their communication modes. Now, everyone does focus on the 3 strands, and those strands are found throughout the standards in every proficiency level. And you'll notice that the strands is a way, too, to make sure that we are aligning to all of the national standards, but again, in a way that works for us in a K-12 classroom. So our first strand is connections to language and literacy. The second one is connections to other disciplines. And then finally, the third one is communities. So that's how our state standards look and how we can quickly communicate how they're structured to someone like an administrator through the administrator guide and other places where we use this particular weave graphic to explain our standards. Now, in contrast, here's an overview of our national standards, and these are the latest documents they've published. I will tell you, for those of you who are gathering information, I always put in the notes the links and things to these different standards and documents that you see, and I'll put those in the archives as well. If you want to see this 2-page document, I'll put in the chat box the links to that so you can go right to it. But basically, this is a 2-page overview of the national standards. You see they have the 5 C's, everything's color-coded. And they break down, actually they have 5 goals, and they break down into a variety of standards, usually 2 to 3 per goal. And then they have an additional page in this flyer that you can download about the world readiness standards for learning languages, and a bit more explanation about the standards and how they work with the goals across the board. So I've talked a lot, and I want to find out what you've been thinking about and what you've been learning. So what is one thing you learned about the North Carolina standards or the actual standards that you thought was interesting? And interesting is for you to define. What I want you to do is in the chat box, put a 10-word note or less describing what it is you learned, either about the North Carolina standards or about the actual standards. Be sure to put NC for North Carolina or ACTFL for ACTFL as the first word of your comment so that we'll know which one you're commenting on and responding to about what you learned. So for example, I might put, NC has had state standards since before I started teaching, which is true. And it might be true for you too. Go ahead, let's pause for a moment and put your note into the chat box so that we can see it. Be sure you're sending it to either all attendees or as broadly as you can so everyone can see what you're sharing. All right, I'm seeing a note that some of you don't have everyone or all attendees as a choice in the chat box, but that's okay. I'll go ahead and read some of the things you're sharing, and then of course, these will be captured and posted with our notes for this broadcast. So a couple things I'm seeing about North Carolina that you're commenting on. We are pioneers with the world language standards in the nation. Also, our standards have a close association with the ACTFL standards. One person said they did not know that our North Carolina standards were first until last year. Also, North Carolina serves as a model for national standards in some ways. From the ACTFL side, we see comments like ACTFL, that each proficiency level has a description of what students can do with language at each level. Also, that for the ACTFL standards, they've been the pathway to the essential standards since 1994. The ACTFL standards have also been used in over 40 states to create their standards or align to their standards. All right. All right, well, thank you for sharing that. And again, there's lots of people sharing about what they have learned about our North Carolina standards, the actual standards in this presentation. So continue to think about that, because it is important, I always believe, to think about where we've come from. That helps us figure out where we're going in the future. All right, so now that we've talked about the history of our standards and kind of have a timeline and an overview of where we are, let's take a look now at our North Carolina revision process for standards and the timeline we're going to use in world languages through 2025 to revise and update our standards. First, I want to share with you the timeline overall, and then we'll kind of drill down into this step by step. So our proposed timeline for world languages specifically is to do our review and exploration starting actually last year and going through 2022. And I will put years up here in relation to school years. So notice that the year we're in, 2020 to 2021, is encapsulated in review and exploration. After that, in the 22-23 school year, we'll actually look at revision of our current standards. Following that, we'll have installation, meaning we'll work on things like professional development and instructional toolkit components to help teachers implement the new standards before we actually roll them out and begin using them. And then in 24-25, we'll actually implement the new standards for the first time, and we'll start using them in the fall of 2024. It's a lot to look forward to. A couple of things here. This standards revision process is set up for everyone, every content area. It is through, again, a State Board of Education policy, just like you saw before with our SCOS-009 saying that we'll have world language standards. The revision policy and how it works for all content areas is actually spelled out in a State Board policy that's SCOS 012. All that information, by the way, including the links to that, is actually posted in the notes of this slide so that you can get to them. And I already see some questions coming out that we're getting to. So there's people asking about how they can contribute to the changes that are going to come about and who makes these decisions. Well, that's what we're going to talk about next. So now that you've seen the overall timeline through 2025, we're going to move down and explore each step one by one and talk about what comes along in there, who's involved, and how decisions get made to move on to the next one. So let's begin at the beginning, review and exploration. We actually get 2 school years to do that, and we're very fortunate in that. Several other content areas got that too. We got that sort of accidentally and through a benefit really from the pandemic situation that we're in. I know sometimes we don't think about the pandemic as having benefits, but in this case it does. We were originally slated to begin our revision process or our review and exploration stage of the revision process this school year, so 2020-21. However, because of the pandemic and the additional longer time that other content areas needed, and the need to make sure we were working with educators across North Carolina, we decided to go ahead and extend that first stage for world languages and a couple of other content areas or subject areas too. So we have 2 school years to do that in. This broadcast, by the way, is one way that we review and explore our current standards to think about the revisions that are needed. Specifically over these 2 years, we're going to be collecting and reviewing feedback and data through various methods. So through webinars like this, through conference presentations like at FLANC, the Foreign Language Association of North Carolina, through focus groups where we might call a group in. Maybe it would be a specific group of educators who work with, let's say, the elementary or middle school or high school or a program like classical languages or dual language immersion. It might be a group that would look specifically at things like being administrators and doing professional development. Or it might be a group that looks at things like high school or a particular language that we want to make sure we get covered well in the standards and then we're not missing anything. We'll also, of course, be doing surveys. And in fact, our poll questions are some of those survey questions that we do all the way along. The great thing about this is as we're reviewing and giving feedback and collecting data about this, my job as your world languages consultant is to collect all of that and make sure we have it ready for the decisions we have to make. We also are going to analyze our current research on standards that are being reviewed. So we're looking at the research behind world language standards. You saw a little bit of it, obviously, with what we looked at with ACTFL and how our national standards have changed and grown over the years. But we'll look at other research having to do with things like language acquisition and biliteracy and how the world is changing when we talk about intercultural competence and what that means for world language classrooms. We'll also review that feedback and data and research along with any state or federal legislative requirements. So one of our state requirements, of course, is that we have world language standards. We'll look at those surveys and other stakeholder inputs. So obviously we call on K-20 educators across the board. We are doing K-12 standards, but we want to make sure we're involving our higher education community. There are many people who work in both worlds. We also have methods instructors at the college level who are preparing pre-service teachers in world languages, and they have to be informed about standards and be involved in that conversation. But there are many others. There are researchers who look at things like standards in general or look at how world languages has changed over time. There's our business community to think about, and how does knowing a world language impact the business community and help someone who's an employee or working with customers. We'll also call on parents and students themselves to find out how things are working with our current standards and what else is needed. And so we'll take all that feedback and review it. Finally, we'll evaluate the findings as a group and present it to our State Board of Education at the end of that time period you see up there, 2020 through 2022. And what we have to do is share with the State Board of Education all the data and input we've collected. So from the things that we're doing today, going forward with surveys and things like that you're going to see over the course of the next year and a half. And so as we do that, we're collecting all that data, we're putting it into a format that we can show how many people we've contacted, who's given feedback, and how we've made sure that everyone's voice could be heard on the questions about our current standards. At the end of that time period, we stand before the State Board of Education and we ask them if we think it's necessary for their approval to go ahead and revise our state standards. I have been told that there might be situations where a group would say, oh, we're very happy with our current standards and we feel there's no need to revise, but that's probably pretty rare. And so our goal would be at the end of this time period to go before the State Board of Education and say, here's what we've learned about how our world language education standards need to change, need to be updated, need to be modified, need to be adapted for the world we're living in and we're going to be sending our students into. And then once the State Board of Education officially gives its approval that we can go ahead and begin that process, we move to the next stage. The next stage will be actual revision, and that'll take place in the 22-23 school year. So we're still a little ways out from that. First, what we'll do is establish and convene a standards writing team. Now, if you want to get involved in something like that, by all means, I encourage you. You look for an online application. That's how we did it last time, and we'll be sending out an application that anyone can fill out. Obviously, the goal would be to get a wide variety of people so that all of our languages, all of our different types of programs and world languages are represented, and different perspectives are there. So again, different programs, different parts of the state, different ways in teaching. We might have face-to-face or online or blended, and different ways we approach world languages. So we want to have a very diverse team that is representative of North Carolina and what we're accomplishing with our world language standards. So look for that application. It will come out probably in the fall of 22. That's the kind of thing, too, that I want to make sure we share broadly on things like listserv announcements and at conference presentations like at Flank and in webinars like this when we get to that point. So that will be available later on when we get to this stage. After that, the writing team will also start to look at all the data that's been collected that made our decision get approved by the State Board to go ahead and revise. And then they will draft a set of standards. Draft one, they of course will share with local districts, charter schools, and other stakeholders. The review period is always at least 30 days. So when there's a draft to be shared that the writing team has put together, we put it out for public review for at least 30 days. And we get their input on it in different ways. Sometimes that's a matter of a PLC or a department or team sitting down together and going through it and giving feedback and sending it in. Sometimes it's taking a look at it and filling out a survey in response to it. Or there might be other ways that we come up with to do that. You probably see this, by the way, if you've been subscribed to our listserv, because sometimes when other content areas are doing this, like social studies, for example, who's just been going through this particular revision phase, when that call for public feedback goes out, we share that across the board because we know that there are teachers who teach all kinds of things, not just one subject or content area. And so you've probably seen that. So as we do each draft, we'll get that public feedback. We'll compile the feedback and share that information with the writing team about what the public said, who said what changes were needed, that kind of thing. And then the writing team will need to reconvene to review that feedback and incorporate the changes they feel are necessary and needed based on that input. And so once they do that, then they will also put out another draft to the public, get feedback again, and you can see there's kind of a cycle here we go through with drafts and then public feedback until we get to a point where we're ready to move forward with what we believe are our new standards. So again, we'll share those additional drafts for stakeholder review and input as appropriate. Typically, a content area has at least 2 and sometimes 3 drafts that are sent out for public review. It depends on the content area and the number of changes needed, of course. You can have more than that, just depending on what people say and how our State Board of Education looks at those recommendations and response. At the end of that, when we come to a draft that we feel is our revised standards, we submit those revised standards to our State Board of Education, and we share with them what we've done, how we've gone about our process, why we've made the changes and revisions that are in there, and we get their feedback and then hopefully their approval. If we stay on track with our timeline, that should come sometime at the end of the 22-23 school year, probably into the summer, if we think about how the standards revision worked last time. So that's the second stage. So once that's done and our newly revised standards are approved by the State Board of Education, then we move on to the installation phase. And that will theoretically be in the 23-24 school year. That starts with launching and disseminating a state-level standards implementation plan that would come from probably the work that the writing team has done, but also be informed by what other groups have done and how things have worked. And then once that plan is disseminated, then each district and charter school can decide how to use that state-level standards implementation plan to establish their own local standards implementation plan based on who they have doing that, how they want to handle their professional development, how they want to do things like write new pacing guides or something like that, and the various programs they have to support through the world language standards. Also, during that installation year, we're going to be modifying or updating our instructional toolkit components that support the standards. Those are things like the administrator guides, as well as things like the unpacking documents and the crosswalk document. Another thing we'll be doing that year is facilitating statewide training. Obviously, when we have a new set of standards, we want to make sure we are supporting educators who are looking at them possibly for the first time. Even if they've given feedback on drafts, of course, now that they know these are going to be our new standards, they want to be able to look at them, think about them, and consider how they will need to adjust their curriculum to make sure it's still standards-based. So statewide trainings will go on. You may recall, if you were in North Carolina in 2011 and beyond, that we had a series of statewide trainings that we actually did face-to-face as summer institutes. But we also had smaller trainings, and we did a lot of things online or at conferences like Flank. So that statewide training could take a lot of different forms. And finally, as part of the installation phase in that school year, we'll collect data and evaluate how the installation is working and what we need to improve. Once we're done with that, we move on to sort of the final phase, if you will, implementation, starting in the 24-25 school year. So this is when we actually begin teaching with the new standards in districts and charter schools throughout the state. So as long as we stay on this timeline, we'll be ready to switch over to our new standards in the fall of 24. So again, we've got a long time, and that's good because this process has a lot of steps. We'll also continue updating and adding instructional toolkit components to support the standards. Some of you may know that, like the administrator guides that we're going to talk about later today, those actually came along several years after the implementation phase, or the first year of the implementation phase in the previous set of standards, but that's because they were really needed. And so we published those a little bit later. We'll all continue to facilitate statewide training and support for educators with the new standards, and make sure we're doing things like webinars and presentations and trainings so that everyone gets comfortable with the state standards. And again, we'll always collect data and evaluate the implementation work. And really, once we implement in the 24-25 school year, we'll continue to these steps you see here, because we'll want to think about, what other instructional toolkit components do we want, what kind of statewide training is necessary over time. if you think back, for example, just to the World Language Webinar series we've done since we got the new standards and started teaching with them in the fall of 2012, there's a number of things we've talked about that helps us refine our practice and make sure that new colleagues are on board too with our state standards. All right, so, and I don't want to forget, sorry, I almost forgot, in the implementation year 24-25 or just beyond, that's also probably where we'll conduct a textbook selection process, but that depends on our textbook evaluation folks in that division, as well as the legislative work around textbook selection. So keep that in mind, but that comes at this point, most likely. So that's our overall timeline. That's kind of where we started. Again, this is proposed. It could be changed a bit, but now that we're underway, I think we're probably on track for this timeline. All right, and I see one question. Did you evaluate what is the impact of the year's gap between the exploration and the implementation? The answer is yes. We're actually evaluating the impact in general as we go. And so this review and exploration phase that we have for 2 years, which is where we're at right now, is where we will look at the impact of that gap. We'll look at a number of things across our standards, and we'll look at that in relation to what we can learn from other states, from our research that's gone on, as well as the actual standards and the implementation of the actual standards and the proficiency scale that they use in other K-12 programs. So we're definitely evaluating all of that. All right, so there's our revision process and timeline. So I want to know what you're thinking. Which statement below most closely matches your thoughts about the standards revision process and timeline that we've just discussed? Would you say this is a good plan, I'm looking forward to seeing it happen? Would you say this is a long plan, 5 years, and it'll be interesting to watch the details unfold? Would you say this is the same plan other content areas use, I'm curious how it's working? Or would you say, I'm still gathering my thoughts on this, check back later? Let me go ahead and open that poll so you can share what your thoughts are on our standards revision process and timeline. All right, go ahead and get in your vote. All right, so here's where you can see, you should be able to see the results in your control panel too. It looks like most of you, about half, said this is a good plan and I'm looking forward to seeing it happen. Several of you, 11, said this is a long plan, and it is 5 years, so it'll be interesting to watch the details unfold. No one chose the third option, and several people said they're still gathering their thoughts about that standards revision process and timeline. That's fine too. This is the process that all of our subject areas use, and so I'd encourage you to get familiar with it and to think about how you'll be involved at each step along the way, because we do want a lot of input and feedback, and we want to make sure we hear your voice in a variety of ways. As I said, we're kind of starting that today because the activities we're doing, the polls we're doing, all of that, I'm collecting as part of our review and data and input on our current state standards. So let's talk about impact. Let's move on to really thinking about the impact of our state standards as we've been experiencing it as world language educators. And today I want to talk about structure. And that's why I've got the picture, our weave graphic again, that shows our 4 standards and 3 strands. I really want us to focus on structure. I know that our proficiency outcomes are also a critical part of our standards, but that's what the webinar in February is for, is to look at proficiency outcomes and the proficiency scale. Today, we're going to look at structure. So, as you know, the state standard structure has 3 strands. We have our connections to language and literacy, or CLL comparisons, and the comparisons, by the way, is the actual C that this strand aligns to. I'm going to put that up on the screen for a moment, a brief description or summary of the connections to language and literacy strand. This is straight out of our standards documents. You might have seen this before, but I'll pause a moment and let you read it to yourself. All right. The next strand is connections to other disciplines, or what we say COD, and it's the connections C in ACTFL's 5 Cs or standards. And again, I'll pause here and let you read the description that's straight from our standards document. And finally, our third strand is communities, abbreviated CMT, which is the same name from the ACTFL standards of communities. And again, we have a short description here that I'll let you read. Those are our 3 strands, and they are woven throughout everything that we do. Now we'll move on to our structure with the 4 essential standards. Some of you who are involved in the work of revising and creating our World Language Essential Standards back in the 2009-10 school year may recall that we were doing an overhaul of the entire standard course of study, which meant that every single subject was updating and revising its standards. As part of that, we decided to implement this essential standards approach. And so there's a lot of research we read on that, and some book studies and things we did about that concept and about having some very focused standards that everyone shared. And that's what we have across world languages. But we like to keep the number low so that we can focus on what's most important and have that as our prominent feature in our standards for the state. So our 4 essential standards, and again, these are just our brief summaries out of our standards documents. The first standard is use the language to engage in interpersonal communication. And obviously that's what ACTFL calls interpersonal communication, or person-to-person communication. Here's the brief description of it from the standards, and I'll let you kind of skim through this here for a moment. Quick reminder on standard number 1, interpersonal communication. It's used in all of our programs with the exception of classical languages, because in classical languages, which are no longer anyone's first language, you don't have this kind of everyday topics that people discuss. And so in classical languages, they don't use standard number 1. However, if they want to use it, they're certainly free to. There are people who are traditional classicists who believe that the focus should be reading and things like that in Latin, but there are also others who think that it would be good to have an interpersonal component to classical languages. So it's their decision. Standard number 2 is understand words and concepts presented in the language, and that, of course, is interpretive communication, specifically listening and reading, but also viewing. And we think about viewing, we think of it in 2 ways. Obviously, viewing things like a computer screen or graphics that go with words you're learning can be a very good way for learners to interpret and use what they're learning to understand what's going on. However, when we talk about visual languages like American Sign Language or ASL, viewing takes on a whole new meaning because, of course, That's what they do when they are looking at signs and different things that they're learning. So again, here's our brief description for standard number 2 of interpretive communication. So you can read through that. All right, so those are our first 2 standards of the 4. Standard number 3 is to use the language to present information to an audience, or what is called presentational communication. And this is specifically speaking and writing. And this is formal speaking and writing, where you can either rehearse what you're going to say or what you're going to sign, or in writing, you can write it out, draft it, get feedback, revise it, that kind of thing. And so again, here's our brief summary from the standards of presentational communication for you to look through. And finally, our 4th essential standard out of the 4 is compare the student's culture and the target culture. And this obviously is the culture standard from actual standpoint. And here's our brief description in North Carolina that we use. So there you are with our 4 essential standards. Now, of course, our state standard structure also involves some other things. Notice that we have clarifying objectives throughout our standards, and those are organized by first proficiency level. And there on the left, you see the actual proficiency scale. That's the screenshot of it from our administrator guides. But also you see the inverted pyramid from actual that shows that proficiency scale starting from the ground up with novice low, and then where language expands, it gets more complex all the way up to the distinguished level. In our state standards, we use novice low through advanced mid proficiency levels because we have K-12 programs, and based on our research and input, that's the kind of proficiency level students can achieve in a K-12 program. So the clarifying objectives go with each proficiency level and are associated with a strand and a standard, and then a number in the list. So you see a screenshot of some of our clarifying objectives, and you can easily tell these are from the novice low level because there's NL as the first abbreviation. They're from the strand connections to language and literacy because you see CLL. They're from standard number 2, interpretive communication, because you see a 2 after the CLL each time. And then there are 5 of them, and they're numbered sequentially in our list of clarifying objectives for that particular section of the standards. All right, so now that we've reviewed the structure and you've really had time to think through it, how well are the strands and standards organized as we look to the future and the revision process? So think about this for a moment. What's your general impression at this moment? Would you say they're very well organized? You think having 4 standards and 3 strands is clear and concise? Would you say pretty well, but you wonder if we should renumber them so that we lead with culture? Would you say fairly well, but you believe we should have input standards first, so we would start with interpretive communication with reading, listening, and viewing? Or do you have other ideas about how we might organize our strands and standards? And you can click off the other ideas and then put your other ideas in the chat box. All right. I'll go ahead and pull up that question and you can respond. Got about 10 seconds left. Go ahead and get your opinion in on the poll. All right. Thank you for sharing. I'm going to go ahead and share the poll results with you so you can see them as well. Most of you who responded to the poll said that you think the standards and strands are very well organized and that you like having 4 standards and 3 strands. Several of you also said that you wonder if we should renumber our standards so that we lead with culture, and that's standard number 1. And about the same number also said that we might want to renumber or rearrange and have input standards first or lead with interpretive communication with reading, listening, and viewing, since that's usually what students are doing first when they're acquiring a language and going to formal classes like we have. We did have some people say they had other ideas. One person said she thinks maybe during the revision process we might want to consider aligning our standard or numbering label with different models, like the European model that uses for their proficiency scale A1 and A2, B1 and B2, etc. That's an interesting idea. And I know that one thing we do have in a crosswalk document already, and in some of the presentations we do about proficiency-based standards, is that alignment showing that. The challenge we get into is that since we are in the US, of course, and we have the actual proficiency scale that is used throughout the US and actually parts of Canada and other places on the North American continent, we usually align to the actual proficiency standards and proficiency levels, but we can also make it more prominent as to what those proficiency levels would be if you were looking at the European model like A1 or A2. It's always something to keep in mind, but it is something too that we do have in our materials, particularly our Linguafolio materials that look at proficiency development. And we also include other proficiency scales. So there are things like the ILR scale, the Interagency Language Roundtable. It's actually used in the US for diplomatic and military work. So that's something we have alignment to as well. And we do have an alignment documents that show how ESL, or the learning of English, and the proficiency scales used by TESOL, the teachers of English to speakers of other languages, how those proficiency levels align to our actual proficiency levels. So it is something good to consider across the board, and to always make sure we're clear, regardless of which proficiency scale we use to, that how that looks in other proficiency scales, in case someone is more familiar with that or wants to look at that across the board when they're thinking about their curriculum. All right, so that's structure. Now, the other thing with our standards is that we have a number of skills and competencies embedded in our World Language Essential Standards. Some of them you've probably already seen or you know about quite well because you think about them on a very regular basis, maybe daily. But I wanted to ask you about some of these skills and competencies that are important to 21st century learning in general, whether it's world languages or anything else. So which of these skills and competencies listed here are embedded already in our World Language Essential Standards? And this is a check all that apply. So do we have, for example, the 21st century skills, what we call the 4 C's of critical thinking, creativity, collaboration, and communication? Do we have biliteracy? Do we have global education? Do we have intercultural competence? Do we have social emotional learning or SEL? And do we have technology skills? So I'll go ahead and open that poll question so that you could share what you know we have embedded already into our state standards. All right, get your answers in, about 5 seconds to go. All right, thank you for responding. I'm going to show you what the responses were, so take a look. And the good news is, no matter what you checked here, you are correct. All 6 of these things listed are actually embedded in our World Language Essential Standards currently. We obviously have 21st century skills, or the 4 C's. One of those is communication, and that takes up our first 3 standards, of course, and different modes of communication that we have. We also have embedded collaboration with the way we do things and the way we connect, and practice those modes of communication with each other, and learn about culture and reach out to communities using that language. There's a lot of critical thinking based on the rigor that's embedded in the standards, and of course some creativity and some encouragements to do different things in your classroom, always with implementing those standards in a curriculum and activities that work for you and your students. We also have biliteracy. Obviously, that's what world language standards are all about, but particularly in reading and writing. So think about standard number 2 and number 3, where we have interpretive communication that looks at reading and listening and viewing, as well as standard number 3 that looks at presentational communication, which is specifically writing and formal speaking. I'll skip down to intercultural competence because that's, of course, evidence in our 4th essential standard of culture. For global education and social emotional learning, we actually have that embedded as well. And you may be familiar with the mapping documents that came out as part of our instructional toolkit with the standards to show specific clarifying objectives throughout the standards and at every proficiency level that reflect global education within a world language learning environment and SEL, or social and emotional learning. And finally, technology skills are embedded as well. One of the requests that we had when we revised the standards and created the World Language Essential Standards was that technology skills always be embedded so that teachers and students were encouraged to use the technology that they had access to. And so all of these are embedded throughout our standards. So I want us to do an activity today that's a little beyond just a poll activity or a chat response. I want us to work with a Jamboard to talk about the standards impact, and particularly these different skills and competencies that are embedded in our World Language Essential Standards. Now, I don't know if you've worked with a Jamboard before. It is a Google tool. So if you have access to Google, you have access to a Jamboard. You can make your own. I will go over some basic instructions of what we're going to do and then show you how to add things to our Jamboard, and then we'll go from there. So we want to measure standards impact on our Jamboard, and so this is a much more open-ended way to kind of gather data and your feedback on that. We're going to tackle the question, how has one of these skills or competencies that we've just talked about impacted your work with implementing the standards in your classroom or program? So I want you to think specifically about one classroom you work with, one group of students, maybe one level of course you teach, or if you're an administrator or have responsibilities like a department chair, to think about your program as a whole. So how have those embedded skills or competencies impacted your work with implementing the standards? What we're going to do is take 1 minute to choose a skill or competency and think about how it's used. Then on a sticky note on the Jamboard, you create for this activity your post with the name of the skill or competency. And by the way, those skills and competencies should still be visible on your control panel, just where you saw them last from the last poll. So that's still there so you can see the different ones. So you title your post with the name of that skill or competency that you want to talk about. You describe how you use it with learners in your classroom or program. Try to get your description to 3 sentences or less. I know we're word people, and so sometimes it's hard for us to do that, but wordsmithing can be a good activity as well. Then include your name on the sticky or remain anonymous. It's totally up to you whether you want to do that. After you do that, take another minute to click on the sticky and start typing all that information in. Take a few minutes to check out the other ideas on the Jamboard that are happening. And know that this activity will last 6 minutes from start to finish. So that's how much time we'll have. So I'm going to pause for a moment. Those are the instructions. Jamboards are a relatively new tool with Google. I first got to use one at the actual convention in November. And then if you were here in December for our broadcast for the fall webinar series, you know that our guest speaker, Delinda Ramirez-Carter, also used a Jamboard for an activity that was extremely successful and everyone seemed to love. Because the Jamboard is a free Google tool, if you already have a Google Suite or the access to that, it's also another tool you can use for an activity or something with your students if you like, or your learners in general. So let's take a look at how you do that. On a Jamboard, and I put our Jamboard on this bit.ly link here that you see, and I'll pause for a moment and put that link in the chat box so you can go straight out to that and be looking at that as well as looking at the instructions here if you'd like to see both at the same time. So I put it on a bit.ly link, bit.ly/impact WLES. Don't forget, on a bit.ly link, capitalization is critical. So on the Jamboard, what you do is you have this little control panel you see here on the screen now. And as you might guess, this control panel lets you do different things. So the little pen at the top is for you to write like you're writing with a pen. Then there's a little eraser to erase that. And then there's some other things. What I want us to focus on is the sticky notes. So you see that as the fourth one down. And so when you click on that, you'll get this screen you see coming up here, and it'll say this is a sticky note, like a Post-it note that you've got. You can make it any color you want. This one happens to be yellow, but you could make it green, blue, pink, or orange. And then you write your message in there. So you answer your question. You put the skill or competency you're going to talk about, and then in 3 sentences or less, hopefully, how you use that in your classroom or with learners. As I said, you can change the color of your sticky note if you would like. And don't forget to hit save, because when you do that, it allows it to be posted so that everybody else can see it. So you'll have a chance to set up a sticky note. All right. So let's go out quickly to the Jamboard. I just clicked on that bit.ly link, so you see there. I see some of you are already populating the Jamboard, which is great. And it's just like I said, you click on the little sticky note one here on the left-hand side. A sticky note pops up. You can change the color if you want. You can write your message. And then you just hit save and it'll post it. I'm going to cancel mine because I've already put one up there. I put the question up there, so the question would be prominent for everyone to see again. And it's on the orange sticky note. If we need more space, by the way, up at the top here, you can see that you can go to the next frame, and we can have as many Jamboards as part of this set as we want. So if you run out of places to put your sticky notes, feel free to go to those other ones up at the top and place your sticky note and answer the question. All right, so I told you I'd give you 6 minutes, and I will. I'm going to go ahead and start timing us now. The instructions are posted here for you just in case you want to refer to them. So go ahead and do that, and we'll pause for that. I'll actually set us a timer for 6 minutes. All right, let's take a look at our Jamboard. I see all kinds of Post-it notes that have been put up. Thank you for contributing so much. Take a look right now, just kind of look over and see what people have commented on, which skill or competency area, and read through a few. Maybe pick a particular color to read through. I'll go ahead and look at the others as well. Oh, we were able to get everything on one. Excellent. Great. All right. Well, I'm conscious of our time. We're wrapping up today. I will go ahead and leave this Jamboard open for the time being, probably until our next webinar about our analysis of our state standards, which is in February. I want people to have a chance to contribute if they didn't. Maybe you're thinking about more things you want to post up here. And also, if people come back and use these materials for their local work, I want them to have the opportunity to add to this Jamboard. All right, so let's move on from this into our last section about lessons learned from the State Standards Toolkit. Now, there are many things we could talk about with the toolkit, so I had to pick just one for today, and I picked the administrator guides. You see them pictured on the right-hand side. Obviously, you see our weave graphic that we've looked at time and again now on these slides, so we're not going to go over that section of them again, but obviously that weave graphic and that explanation are from our administrator guides. You can find all of our State Standards Toolkit under the Standards tab on our website, and I have a bit.ly link for that you see, bit.ly/ncdpiwl. And next to the standards information you see here at the top, you see what are considered sort of the required parts of our instructional toolkit. And so those include the crosswalk, which is a look at how our new standards are different from past standards, but it also shows how our new standards in North Carolina compared to things like the national standards with ACTFL or the National Classical Language Standards from the American Classical League, as well as the National ASL standards and other groups. We also have unpacking documents, and that's where we take our standards and strands, but particularly the clarifying objectives by program or by course level or what have you, and break them down into sort of more digestible parts, if you will. In addition, we have mapping documents now that show how things like global education and CEL are embedded throughout our standards, and again, with specific clarifying objectives pointed out as examples of that. We also have other components of the instructional toolkit, and those are created based on request and or need from the field. The administrator guides are one such thing. These instructional toolkit components are sorted out and organized as curriculum writing resources, formative assessment tools, or program resources like you see on the right. And as I said, we're going to focus on our administrator guides today, but there's a lot for us to explore. And some of that we'll be looking at as we go further into the year with our analysis component or other parts of our World Language webinar series for the winter and spring of 2021. But let's look at those administrator guides. There are 3 of them. There's one for classical language programs K-12, one for dual and heritage language programs K-12, which includes dual language immersion or DLI, and heritage language programs, which used to be things like Spanish for native speakers courses, as well as modern languages. And those are all languages K-12 that are taught as a separate subject. And you see we have alphabetic, logographic, and visual languages. So those are our 3. The administrator guides actually grew out of some older documents we had several standards ago, back in the late 90s, where we had what were called administrator briefs or principles briefs. However, when the writing team with the standards, as well as the group that looked at the instructional toolkit needs, looked at the principles briefs, they didn't like how they were arranged because they were arranged by grade span, like elementary, middle school, and high school. And they didn't really speak to our current needs and things like proficiency-based standards that we had just adopted. So we changed them up quite a bit. first and foremost, every administrator guide starts with a description of the K-12 program. So think about basically pulling the description from the standards but making it very prominent, because these administrator guides are meant to be look-for documents, things that a principal or other administrator could grab quickly to get a better understanding of what we do in world languages, particularly if that administrator who's, let's say, evaluating a teacher in a classroom doesn't have a world language teaching background. So there's a quick description of each type of program and what makes them unique. There's also, on 2 out of the 3 administrator guides, what we call our research and testing results. And so the one you see on the left that came up first is from the classical languages one, and then on the right is from the modern languages one. They start out with how the study of another language correlates with things like higher test scores on standardized tests, greater cognitive flexibility, better English vocabulary, those kinds of overall benefits that we see students experiencing and people experiencing who are bilingual or multilingual. Then they drill down and take a look at the impact of 3 or more levels of world language courses on SAT scores. And of course, SATs are done in English, and they measure things like reading, math, and writing. The difference between the two for the research and testing results is that the AP exam results for both Latin on the classical languages administrator guide and a summary of the AP world language results just for North Carolina in general are included on the modern languages administrator guide. And AP exams and scores above 3, as we know, 3, 4, or 5 on AP exams, leads to college credit. North Carolina now has a uniform credit policy with all of the University of North Carolina campuses, meaning that if a student presents a score of 3, 4, or 5 on AP exam, there's already a document set up to show a student and their teacher what kind of college credit they will get for achieving that score. Now, on the administrator guides for dual and heritage languages, we don't have those testing results because you can get those on the other 2. But we do have, in that space, the characteristics of dual and heritage programs. And so you see on the left the DLI, part of dual and heritage programs and the characteristics of it. And then on the right, heritage programs like we used to be Spanish for native speakers, or those bridging courses that bridge students into higher levels of language study who may be taking a language that they speak at home or as their first language. And so we did that because our feedback from the field shared that dual and heritage programs are the most novel to administrators. It's the one that they probably didn't have a lot of experience with as a student. Most of our principals and other administrators probably weren't in a DLI program and probably weren't in a heritage language program. And so they felt like the field was saying we really need a description of these so it's clear to administrators what exactly we're talking about when we say dual and heritage programs and what that looks like in their schools and with the students that they have. On the back of the first page of administrator guides is a section called In the Blank Classroom. So the classical languages one has in the classical language classroom, the modern languages has in the modern language classroom. And this is a description of what an administrator would see if they walked into those classrooms, what the expectations are, what a 21st century world language classroom should look like, how often the target language should be being used, 90% or more, obviously, from the actual recommendation, and how these different programs are similar to and different from each other. So there's a section for each of those. And on the next slide, you see the section for the dual and heritage language classroom on the back of that first page. So once again, we've got a description of it. Starts out with our DLI, talks about our heritage language sequence, and clearly shows the sequence of modern languages to heritage languages so that it's clear. Finally, in the administrator guides, the last 2 pages include the NESA Standards Administrator Feedback Tool. NESA, of course, is our state evaluation instrument, the North Carolina Educator Evaluation System. This is what our teachers and everyone is evaluated on, all educators. And we wanted a way to help our administrators, again, who probably didn't come from world language teaching backgrounds, know what to look for based on the standards that they're evaluating teachers on. So we took the Teacher Effectiveness for Language Learning project that looks at things like best practices in a world language classroom, and we divvied those up amongst the 5 standards that our administrators will be looking for in evaluations. We made sure that it was clear what was from the NESA standards, of what they would look for and how that would be within a world language classroom by underlining the wording that directly from the NESIS materials. We also have at the top a way for them to start learning about languages by obviously noting the teacher and the date and the time period and the program, but doing a little educating about what we mean by alphabetic language, logographic language, and visual language. So this is an administrator tool that they can use as part of their evaluation and feedback with world language teachers. That brings us to poll question number 6. I know you're probably eager to look at the administrator guides, and I'm certainly I'm going to include that here. I'm putting that in the chat box as well, and you can go out the page that has all 3 of them and download them as you need to. But I wanted us just to look at the sections quickly and think about which of these sections of the administrator guides do you think are most helpful. And by most helpful, it could be most helpful to your administrators, most helpful to you in talking with people about your program, or in some other way. How you define that is up to you, but which of the sections of the administrator guide do you think are most helpful? You can choose up to 3. We have our program descriptions, the research and testing results we looked at, the characteristics of dual and heritage programs, the in the blank classroom, and the NESIS standards administrator feedback tool. So I'm going to go ahead and launch that. This is our last poll, by the way, because we're almost out of time today, but I think we'll make it. So go ahead and put your answer in about which of the sections of the administrator guides do you think are most helpful. And again, we're looking at impact here and thinking about how these might look when we go to update or revise our standards. All right, time's almost up. So you can take a look in your control panel for how people responded. And frankly, everybody likes some of these sections. Obviously, the ones that got the most vote were the program descriptions, and those are great for a quick overview to really help an administrator know what those programs mean and what they consist of K-12 in the 21st century. We also had several people who liked the NESIS Standards Administrator Feedback Tool. We've heard a lot of good comments on that. We've also seen that feedback tool used in training by watching, let's say, a video, either from someone's class or from the video libraries that are available online of world language classrooms, to train and really use that as a way to think about how you can give feedback to a world language teacher. Many of you also like the research and testing results for classical and modern language programs. That's always a hit with administrators who like to see things like higher test scores and students who are more cognitively engaged and creative and critical thinkers. And then finally, people also like the characteristics of the dual and heritage programs as well as in the classroom sections as a way to really give a realistic picture of what administrators should see when they walk into our classrooms. All right. Thank you for sharing that. Again, this is part of our feedback and input for our standards revision process. Unfortunately, we don't have time today to do this activity, but if we had, I would have asked you to go ahead and type in the chat what section of the administrator guide do you think is the best one, not just one of 3, for helping administrators understand world languages and why. Unfortunately, we're out of time, but I do want you to be thinking about that because it's likely that'll come up again in a webinar or a focus group or something like a survey, let's say, where you can give your feedback on that. All right, that brings us for our wrap up today. We are right at 5:30. Wrap up will not take long, but I understand if you have to go. Remember, this is being recorded, so you can always come back later and get it. Our World Language webinar series continues. Today's one is grayed out because we're done with it, but the next one in the winter series will be on Wednesday, February 17th at the same time, 4 to 5:30. Our spring series continues to look at our World Language Essential Standards, particularly as the milestones we've reached with them, and also the advocacy we do with them, and that'll be in March and May, respectively. If you missed our fall series, or if you want to go back and revisit it, it was on the implementation of the World Language Essential Standards. You can see there were broadcasts that focused on one or two of our essential standards each time. And the archives for that, the slides, the recording, the links, the handouts are posted on our webinar series information page at the link you see on the screen. That's the same place the archives from this broadcast will be posted as well. Several things we looked at during the fall webinar series included things like our Teaching World Language Remotely resource bank that you can get to at bit.ly/teachwlremote. It is on the World Languages Google site, and it was designed with the thought in mind that as we work more online with our students, whether in remote teaching environments or just hybrid environments, or in general in using technology in our classroom and using tools like that it'd be good to have a place to have things like technology resources, multilingual resources, some language-specific resources, and digital tools by communication mode or by essential standard. And that's what we have, that Teaching Remote. I just put that in the chat box too, in case you need it. Finally, I want to make sure you know that always available on our World Languages Google site are opportunities for educators and students on the K-20 opportunities list under the resources tab. And that's things like awards, contests, grants, scholarships, all of that posted by deadline. And we also have upcoming professional development beyond what NCDPI provides on the K-20 PD list. You may want to check that page often because there are updates and new offerings added almost every day. In addition, there are some upcoming conferences that you may want to know about or may already be familiar with. The one most soon is the virtual spring conference from FLANC, the Foreign Language Association of North Carolina. It'll be on Saturday, February 27th. It is totally virtual, and it represents the best of the FLANC fall conference with the same presenters invited back to do a different 15-minute concurrent session. The FLANC Spring Conference also includes DLI, or Dual Language Immersion School site visits on Friday, February the 26th. Again, all done virtually. In March, we have our regional conference. SCOLT is the Southern Conference on Language Teaching, and that encompasses North Carolina and over a dozen states in the Southeast. And the SCOLT 21 will also be a totally virtual conference with both synchronous and asynchronous sessions. In the notes and on our archives, I will post links specifically to those conferences so that you can get that information and participate in those conferences if you would like. All right, that brings us to wrap up and questions. One thing to know is you can always subscribe to the World Language Listserv. So if you want to get email notices and newsletters and announcements and messages about things like upcoming professional development with the webinar series or opportunities like grants and scholarships, sign up for the DPI listservs. We have those for world languages in the 4 areas you see there. I will make sure that everyone who attends today will be signed up for the World Language Instructors listserv if you're not already. But you can also sign up for other listservs you may be interested in, like charter schools, global ed, legislative updates, that kind of thing, depending on what you do. So I'm going to go ahead and put that link in there to subscribe to the DPI listservs in our chat box so that you have that handy and can do that for whatever you're interested in. Finally, I think I've mentioned already several times, the archives from this broadcast will be posted on the webinar series information page within the next week. Archives include a recording, the slides in 3 formats so that you can easily download them and repurpose them as you need to, and the handouts and links that we've talked about today. Just a reminder, individuals who participate in a live broadcast of one of the NCDPI World Language webinars can earn contact hours towards the CEU for licensure renewal. That contact hour comes in the form of an email with an attached certificate, probably about 1 week from today. Always keep in mind that those kinds of contact hours or professional development hours do have to be approved by local education agencies like districts or charter schools for that to work towards your licensure renewal. And that's all I have for you today. I thank you for joining me and for sharing all of your information, the polls or surveys that we did, as well as the Jamboard and the chat box activities. If you ever need to get the NCDPI World Languages website or Google site, just go to bit.ly/NCDPIWL. If you need to connect with me, you see my email and phone number. I will tell you the email is probably the better option, but it's your choice. And I hope to hear from you and continue to get your feedback on our current standards and how we might want to update those or revise them for the future.